You find your client the perfect property, the numbers penciled out, clean and closing, everybody's happy, and then they put the wrong tenant in the property.
The deal didn't fail. The tenant actually failed. And that's what most agents never really think about, that part.
Yeah, which is wild because the tenant is supposed to be the asset. I run 7 properties across 3 different states, and I help people place tenants here in Northern Virginia. The property is actually the easy part.
So staying here in Maryland, I house hack my primary residence and I own 4 rental properties. So I screen my own tenants. So we're practicing what we preach.
So today we're talking about how to get a property legal and ready to rent, how to find quality tenants, get leases done, get deposits, pet rents, all the disclosures, everything that you need to know to be a landlord and all the changes in between Virginia and Maryland.
So let's get right into it.
So today I'm going to share with you exactly how I've helped several landlords in Northern Virginia. One particular story comes to mind where I met a self-managing landlord and then pointed out all the things he wasn't doing in providing his tenants, that if he needed to land in court, he would end up on the losing end because he wasn't providing the right disclosures. And I'm going to share the stories of what it's like to put the wrong tenants in place with my fourplex from hell.
Yeah, and I'll share a few different stories, but one that I'm going to go into details about is when I had a property that was sitting vacant for over 60 days and I was eating that mortgage every month and it was painful. But one of the main reasons why we wanted to do that is because we had a strong rental criteria that we wanted to keep in place. So I'm going to go into a little bit more about that.
All right, Nico, before we start getting into the stories of what people should and shouldn't do, why do you think an agent should care what happens after closing?
It's so funny, right? Most agents get the sale, they get their commission, they wipe their hands clean, and they never really think about their clients. I know they're like deuces. I know a lot of agents, we pride ourselves on being relationship based, but a lot of times once they get that commission, they're on to the next one. And I think when you're an investor friendly agent, especially when you're working with landlords, in my opinion, I think that's really half the battle is when you get to the settlement table. And then now what, right? You either hand it off to a property manager, or if you're going to help them find their next tenant, that's really a whole different art form. So I think it's important to continue that conversation, maybe even before the settlement table, like, hey, we need to do a few different things to get it rent ready. I work with a lot of landlords, long-term investors that want to hold on to properties for 10, 20, 30 years, maybe forever. So the real art is finding a tenant. And that's what I believe there's a gap with a lot of agents that don't do that, or agents that they don't understand that part of the business.
Yeah. And I'm thinking a practical approach for the future is there's 2 sides to this coin, right? If you find a good tenant for this landlord, the odds are is that they're going to come back to you and they're going to recommend you to their friends that are also investors. Like, hey, I have this awesome agent that finds me the best tenants. I love them, and keeps recommending or keeps using you. So you have a pipeline of business. So that's one side of it. But then what I have found is when you are able to place really good tenants, especially here in Northern Virginia, they're usually well qualified. They have good jobs, good credit scores. And honestly, those are the people that eventually become buyers. And if you are like showing your value to the tenant and the landlord, you're getting business from the landlord ongoing in the future. And there's a really good chance if you stay top of mind with that tenant, you're going to end up being their buyer's agent if you play your cards right.
That's such a good point. And I know that's been like a really big part of your business, your personal business, right? And as you worked with tenants 4 years ago that are becoming buyers now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
I've actually had 2 stories like that. I had one that rented my mom's townhouse. I helped my mom as her listing agent. And then that person ended up coming to me and I helped him buy a house out in Springfield area. It's, a little bit, it's about 15 minutes away from here. But now he's military. He's transferred to the West Coast. And he was thinking about selling, but I actually encouraged him to keep it because he knows he's going to come back to this area with the military. So I actually became his listing agent for the rental on that property. So that's just one case where it's kind of circled back. And then I have another tenant who I helped them find their place. And I admit I didn't do a great job staying top of mind, but I did a really good job during the transaction. So they reached out like a year and a half later, and I helped them pick up a $900,000 house in Arlington.
Love that. Love that. And I love that point where you're talking about like you're working with, that could have been a sale, right? The guy that was moving to across the country. And most agents will be like, oh, yeah, you smell the commission breath on them. But us as real estate advisors, we're really trying to help them in their best situation. So if they knew they were going to come back in a year or two, then they would have to look for a whole nother property. Maybe it makes sense to keep it as a rental. Maybe they have a low interest rate and their payments are relatively low where you're cash flowing on the property. So a lot of agents don't think that way. They're just ready to get the sale and again, wipe their hands clean. But our job is to help them navigate, one of the biggest financial decisions they're going to make in their life. So I think those are great points. But I know we were talking a little bit off camera, and I think you briefly teased your story about meeting with a landlord at a coffee shop. You mind talking about that and how you weave that in and eventually help a self-managing landlord?
Yeah. So this landlord wasn't even my client. I was actually going to his property to look at it for some out of state military clients that were moving to the area. So I was going on their behalf, taking video tours. And so he was self managing. So he's the person that met me at the property to give me the tour. I think there were still tenants in the building, if I remember correctly, in the property. And we were just talking. And I was just pointing out a couple things that I noticed and, telling him how he could use the space a little bit better. We went in the backyard. There were some trees that had a lot of ivy growing on them. And I had just pointed that out to him. I mean, it was really minor. It was things like that. Like, hey, you may want to get someone out here to cut the ivy because they had gone up pretty far. It was obvious it had been happening for a while. And I said, that could be a problem in the future because the ivy ends up choking out the tree. You're going to have a limp ball in the house. Like it's minor. It may be a pain in the ass to get someone to come out to take a look at it now, but it will save you in the future. And we started chatting. He told me he had some other properties in other states because he was also military. And I explained how my husband and I, military affiliation, we've done some investing out of state as well. And we manage those properties ourselves. And then somehow we started talking about just like different disclosures, how to cover your bases as a landlord. And he had no idea in the state of Virginia. I'm sure other states have them. You have to look up your regs for your state specifically. But in Virginia, there is something called tenant rights and responsibilities. It's a document that lists like basically all the rights and responsibilities of the tenants. And the landlord's responsible for providing that to a tenant. In the beginning, when they're getting their lease signed, both parties are supposed to sign off on it. The landlord is also responsible for doing the initial pre-move and walkthrough. And also, if it's an older than 1978 house, they're supposed to provide lead paint disclosures. And he didn't know about any of these things. And I told him he was putting himself in a bad position. He hadn't to date had an issue, but at some point he ended up with a tenant that was a problem tenant and he tried to take them to court. Like I said earlier, like if you're trying to recoup money or whatever the case may be, he would probably be on a losing end because one of the first things the judges here in Virginia at least ask is, did you provide the tenant their rights and responsibilities? Like, do they know their rights and responsibilities as a tenant? And if you say no, then that puts you in a position where the judge can be like, well, then they didn't know what their rights and responsibilities are, so I can't help you in recouping some of the funds that you may have lost. So I was able to educate him. He asked me out to, that sounds weird when I say it that way, but he asked me on a coffee date, totally platonic, but just to kind of go over what these disclosures actually were versus just chatting about them briefly and how he should incorporate them into his self-managing practices to cover his basis going forward in the future. And I pointed him to the state websites where he could look this up because I told him he might want to check these regularly because they do get updated every so often. So you want to make sure you're staying on top of the rules and regulations.
So, Anna, how many people do you think are just like this individual, like mom and pop landlords that are just self-managing? They're not in the industry like you and I, so they don't keep up. Like you said, things change every 2-3 years, and this could be a niche. Like, did anything come of it? Did you end up helping this client in the future, or was it more just like informative, trying to provide value?
It was informative, more trying to provide value. That was one of those instances where, like, he did come back to me later on and he was thinking about listing the property for sale. And then he ended up, like, we were engaging, we were talking about it. And then his wife, because, in a lot of cases, the wife is the boss, she had a friend that was an agent and she was like, I want to go with my friend. So unfortunately, I did not get that listing, but I was on top of his mind as far as someone he wanted to work with to do the listing. So, and that's because I actually took the time to sit down with him, explain to him those things. And honestly, I think a lot of self-managing landlords, I don't know an exact percentage, but I know I've come across more than just him, several along the way that don't know the rules, don't know the regulations. Actually, probably about a month ago, I was helping another tenant client, military, moving here. They found a self-managing landlord. They asked me to review the lease to take a look at it. First of all, the lease that the the landlord was using was from 2002. Like it was a state lease, like NVAR, Northern Virginia Association of Realtors. They got it from someone, but it was from 2002. And a lot of the like things in the contract were dated. Like it wasn't even listing, it wasn't even referencing the correct like military federal policy for when military members like move, how they can break leases and what the ramifications of that are. That has changed in the last 20 something years. And this person was not providing any of the disclosures I mentioned earlier. So honestly, I told my tenant, if you feel comfortable signing this, like that's fine. This is very dated and these are the disclosures they're supposed to provide to you. I'm telling you about them, but this is the landlord's responsibility to provide to you. So honestly, if anything goes south where they end up taking you to court, you're actually in a great position as a tenant because the landlord is kind of shooting themselves in the leg by not providing protection for themselves by providing the correct disclosures.
Yeah. And a lot of them, like you said, like they just don't know.
What?
They've done things one way for so long. Maybe they've been self-managing for 20, 30, 40 years. And they're like, why would I change what I'm doing? So that actually brings us to our next question where we're talking about like the roadmap of what it looks like from a landlord, whether you're working with them as a client or if they're self-managing themselves, right? So the first thing that they need to do is, we're talking about these rental license and getting the home legally ready to rent. So in Maryland, they have a rental license, whether you're going through Montgomery County or through Prince George's County or my main markets. And you have to get lead paint, like a certified lead paint person, a radon test, at least if you're here in Montgomery County. So you have to do these things to prep before you even put it on the market. So that's the first steps, right? And then the second steps are, if you're a landlord yourself or if you are an agent about to work with a client, you prep the house, right? Maybe you do some painting. You're going to walk it like you're selling the house, but you're going to walk it, talk about, oh, maybe if we repaint this to make it more neutral, we clean the carpets, just make it rent ready because us as agents, we're going to be taking professional pictures. Again, it's going to be a professional listing. We're going to put it on the market. So you want to make sure first impression is very important, right, Anna? So you're going to make it nice and clean. And then don't go out there and take pictures with your cell phone, right? How many times have you seen, I'm sure Anna has seen it when we're looking, scrolling through the pictures and we see a guy taking a picture of the bathroom. He's in the
mirror.
in the mirror. He's in the background, or just like things that, a professional photographer will see, right? They will move some things and just make the rooms feel bigger. Everybody nowadays is looking online before they actually go out and tour the property. So why not put your best foot forward, right? So we're going to market it, whether you're working with an agent like Anna and I, or if you're doing it yourself, you're going to market it. You're going to put it on the multiple listing service. You can put it, we're going to be talking about like long-term tenants right now, but there's so many different short-term, mid-term avenues if you want to market. I'm just going over the highlights. After that, you're going to have a tenant criteria, right? What you're looking for in a tenant. And you want to be very crystal clear because there are fair housing laws that you want to abide by, whether you are working as the landlord's agent or if you're a self-managing landlord, have that in writing. So before anybody applies, you send that to them. And if they feel like that they meet that criteria, they'll send an application. And then you approve. If everything looks good, you'll write the lease. And then you're going to go through a moving walkthrough. And that is all the steps that I could think of. Was there anything that, I know I just briefly on all that, but was there anything that I was missing?
No, I think you touched on the key points, getting it legal in some jurisdictions like in Alexander, Fairfax County, a lot of parts in Northern Virginia, you don't need a license to do a rental. I would say depending, like you said, we're talking long-term rentals, but if you are thinking about doing something other than long-term, like short-term, if you have an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, or like a space that you want to rent out on a shorter basis, you want to check your local jurisdiction rules for your client because in some cases it can't be done unless the person is living in the main house and then you can rent out an ADU. Sometimes you can, sometimes you have to register the ADU, but there's no fee. So I will say that's a very important part. And then, like I said, just knowing, and not even just a local stuff, but making sure the smoke detectors are up to date. In Virginia, it is the landlord's responsibility to do a check of the smoke detectors every year and provide a certificate to the tenant or some notification to the tenant saying the smoke detectors are working and they're functional. And that's the little things that landlords don't know how we can be of use to them. But then, yeah. And then the tenant criteria, like walking your client, or if you're renting your own property, walking your client through what tenant criteria looks like and helping them craft what the right tenant criteria is for them, I think is super important from the beginning, and just explaining to them the importance of applying that criteria every single time. Not only does it save you from fair housing, but it saves you from a bad tenant in a
Yeah.
lot of cases.
It's got to be universal. Like if somebody doesn't meet all your criteria and, like you said, fair housing, if somebody else comes and they're like, wait a minute, this person doesn't have certain credit score or things like that, you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot. So having that crystal clear. And then I wanted to share one more thing. You talked about short-term rentals. For those who are doing it and you're thinking of doing it like in an association or a condo or a townhome, there are associations that do restrict short-term rentals. So make sure you're looking at your association docs to make sure that's doable. But specifically about long-term rentals, 12 months to 24, however, more than a year is what we're going to be kind of diving into today.
Yeah, something else I think people miss or don't think about is, for me personally, what I encourage my clients and what I do with my rentals is anyone over the age of 18 that's going to be listed as an occupant of that property, even if they're not responsible for the lease, has to apply and submit an application where a credit check, background check, eviction check, like all that's done, because they may have a sibling that is a rock star that is like the model tenant, but then they're down on their luck, sibling needs a place to live, comes and lives with them and causes all kinds of problems that you weren't expecting. Like they said, oh yeah, my brother's moving in with me, but you didn't do a background check on that person because they weren't responsible for the lease. And then you end up with just as many headaches as if you had rented it to that person directly. So that's something I think a lot of people miss. I feel like a lot of landlords almost feel bad having them, like, because you have to pay for each application. There is a fee through most systems when you do background checks to pull that kind of information. So that is a cost to the tenant that everyone over the age of 18 needs to apply.
Yeah. Having that in your rental criteria. So what I do for my properties as well as for my clients, I have like a 1-page sheet that explains the whole process, right? They're going to put in an application. We use Rent Spree, put in an application. Everybody above the age of 18 has to do it. And that's such an important part, right? Like the parents might be great or vice versa, right? They might have their daughter or son that has, great credit and the mom and dad have horrible credit or have collections, evictions, and things that would make them not appealing as tenants. So making sure that you have everybody put the application in, but sending that ahead of time, right? It is an expense. So say, hey, if you feel like you meet this criteria, feel free to move forward and apply.
Yes, I take it. I've learned a lot, and we'll talk about that story later about like tenant trials and tribulations. So I've put a lot of those steps in place. And another thing, I'll pop up with all kinds of things that I do as tips. But another thing is in that criteria that you send when you mention that there is an application with a fee, I make it in bold letters that says it is non-refundable. I put it wherever I can because I have had tenants that then dispute the charge with their credit card company or their bank, saying
Really?
that I falsely charged them for something because they want to recoup that background check fee. So I have learned to put it in multiple places. So when that credit card company or bank comes back to me, I have multiple documents that show that this was a non-refundable fee for an application and that the tenant was aware and they digitally signed. So because of that, I also started doing for my personal rentals a Google Doc, a pre-screening form for potential tenants that if they're interested and they reach out, I send them this Google form with a handful of questions with like credit score, move-in date. Is your credit above 600? Do you have a cosigner? If not, who's going to be living at the property? Pets, yes or no? And have them fill that out in advance so that I have an idea of who I'm going to be working with or who potentially is going to be seeing the property. And then I schedule the showings. I actually have them do that step first because we get a lot of tire kickers.
Mm-hmm. Especially on like places like Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist. If you end up marketing in some of those, they can click one button and be like, is this still
Interested.
available?
Yeah.
Interested. Is this still available?
Yep.
So I'm going to talk about my rental criteria. Right? So it's going to be different from every market. You can use what Ann and I use, or you can tweak it a little bit. But for us, a 640 credit score is what we're looking for. We're looking for income at least 3 times the monthly rent. So this is household income. So everybody above the age of 18 can, yeah, as long as it's 3 times. And the reason why we do that is we want to make sure they're not living paycheck to paycheck, right? They're not struggling to pay the rent. So I think that's kind of standard for most people. I like having no collections, and no eviction records. This actually, I added into it recently. I was working with the landlord and they seemed great. They were ready to move in. And then the application came in and they had a eviction court case like the following week. So it was one of those things that you want to just make sure that if they had an eviction with someone else, they'll probably have a story behind it, but you really don't want to get somebody that's going into evictions. And it's solid rental history and references, right? You want to talk to their previous landlords. You want to talk to their references, maybe talk to their employment, just verify their income. Most of the time I ask for W-2s or 1099s if they are self-employed, just to verify all the income and then cross-reference. I know Anna does this very thoroughly and she has some software that I'm sure she could talk about, but this is very important whether you're working for your own rentals or if you're working with the clients, right? They'll put an application. You take 48 hours to actually sift through that application to make sure what they're saying is actually accurate. Was there anything, Anna, that you add to yours?
Yeah. So I will say, like you said, it's very dependent. I help clients in Northern Virginia. So the credit score here is higher. It tends to be higher. But then I have properties in Ohio, Southern Virginia, and those tend to be lower because I know the like group of the pool of renters have slightly different credit things going on. So like down in Southern Virginia, my minimum credit score is 600. But then if everything else checks out, I do have in my criteria, it says, if tenant meets all other criteria, we'll consider with an additional deposit. I put that up front. So if they want to proceed and keep going, they know, okay, I may still have a chance at this, but I may have to put an additional deposit. So I have them do first and last month's rent. 2 pro tips that I will recommend that people pay attention to is to look at the court records for your state. So the state of Virginia has a website where you can go and you can put someone's name in and you can pull up like any court cases that have been affiliated with that person, because in a lot of cases you get professional, I'll say eviction daughters. They go and they make your life a living hell. And then you take them to court. And before you get that eviction like granted, they get out and they finally like leave the property. So that never goes through. And those evictions never show up on their history. But you can look up in court records when they've been taken to court, even if it didn't, even if it got dismissed because they did end up moving out, you can see that they were taken to court for evictions, even though the process was never completed. So that's number one. And then if you're checking their previous rental history, to speak to previous landlords. If it's another self-managing landlord, it's much easier. But if they live like in an apartment complex, or if you're trying to reach out to an employer, you may need to have that tenant sign a form that allows release of that information, because many apartment complexes and employers will not speak to you unless you have a signed release from the person for them to speak to you. Some still won't do it and they'll send it to a person and the person has to provide it to you. But that is something else you may run into if you're trying to do reference checks and it's like in a professionally run apartment complex or an employer.
Yeah. So Anna has so many pro tips because she's done with a lot. And I'm constantly learning of things that she's doing and things that she's learning to try and implement in my business. And a lot of this probably rooted from the fourplex from hell, right? We're going to briefly, if you're part of this show, you probably heard SWAT coming, knocking down doors and things like that of her property down in Ohio. But as of recently, and I'll let you share the news, but talk about the fourplex and how what you learned from it, inheriting tenants or working with a property manager that had their own rental criteria, and basically all your learning lessons from this property.
Yeah. So wait, am I sharing the story or the lessons? Which one? Both?
I would say that as concisely as you can, like the lessons that you got from, the inherited tenants and tenants that your property manager placed. And then you could tell them, the good news that,
Okay.
that you got recently.
Well, I'll start with the good news and then I'll go with the bad. So the good news is that we sold the fourplex from hell and it moved relatively quickly. It was within a couple weeks, we were able to sell it off to another investor. This was out in Akron, Ohio. So sometimes there does come a point where an investor, I say I would never sell a property. I used to say that. I don't say that anymore because there does come a time where you just have to trim your portfolio for your own sanity. The brain damage on this property wasn't worth it. So The short story is we actually bought this building empty. This is one of our first investment properties. We didn't know. We were out of state. So we hired a property manager. We didn't vet the property manager very well. So she placed tenants. We were just happy to get bodies in the building, not realizing the caliber of tenant that was being placed into the building. Eventually, we moved on from her to another property manager because we just knew that we needed to do that. But these tenants continued on. So actually, our second property manager inherited these tenants, and they were just not vetted well. These were people that didn't meet our rental criteria, but we were convinced by our property manager at the time, like, this is what it is. This is just the way the market is. You can't depend on credit score because people fall on hard times and they just need a break. And we had people we didn't realize when they first moved in, but eventually we learned, we had somebody that had just been released from prison after 10 years. We had another person that was never proven, but potentially running a prostitution ring out of one of the units. And then we had another that didn't have great credit, but she was down on her luck and she needed an opportunity. But it turns out she had family members in the area, like literally across the street. And they were the ones that did the most damage to the property because they just didn't care. They had no interests. And so I learned very quickly to set the rental criteria and stick to the rental criteria that you have put in place. It's there for a reason, not just fair housing. It does protect you from instances like that where you're like, well, they have a sob story. Maybe I can rent to them. And then that comes back to bite you in the ass, if I'm being honest. And so following that criteria and then vetting people really well, because people lie. They will put references on the application that aren't true. They'll say, this is my previous landlord, and it's their like uncle. So vetting them very well, following your criteria and sticking to your criteria. And honestly, in my opinion, it is better financially and for your mental sanity to leave a unit empty a few months longer and wait for a good tenant than to just put the first person into it. And I learned all that. And I also learned in some cases, I needed to learn those things so I could manage my own properties because I was managing the manager so much and I just kept hitting my head against the same wall. So now, if and when we get to the point where we're ready to hand it off to someone else, either we're going to train them how to be the property managers we want them to be, or we know to ask much more specific questions to try to find the right property manager than we did before. I don't know how concise that was.
No, that was good. And the best part of speaking to Anna and Brian, weekly and things like that is I get to hear all their stories and I learn from their horror stories. So that actually brings me to my most recent property, my Bird deal that took a little bit longer for the construction, took a little longer for permits. And then we finally got it up on the market for rental. And of course it was the winter time. So it took a little bit longer. And on the flip side of what Anna was talking about, she trusted somebody, but they were saying that property manager, and they got somebody in there that really shouldn't be. So I had all those stories, not only from Anna, but other people that were like, you really have to stick to your rental criteria. And it really hurts. It really hurts when you're holding a property vacant. In our case, it was over 60 days. Guess who's paying for that mortgage, right? You as an investor, you're paying for that and it hurts. You're marketing it. You're getting good feedback. In our case, it's basically a brand new home. A lot of good feedback, but no, we did have applications that for one or the other reasons didn't, whether it was credit or the income didn't look like it was going to meet our criteria. It didn't work out. So we held tight, and I was talking to my brother and we own the property together. I was like, hey man, I might tweak this down the road, my rental criteria, but I think we should hold tight and make sure that we get a good quality tenant. I'm here in Maryland in Montgomery County. It's less landlord friendly than other states. So long story short, we ended up getting some great tenants. I actually was on the phone with them yesterday, and a nice older family. They met all our rental criteria and they are so happy to be there. So it ended up being like a feel good story for me, like holding off, and they had their own reasons why they were leaving their property. They were there for 17 years, which us as landlords, we like hearing that, when they want to stay there forever. So that was just one story that I could think of. Like, yes, it hurts holding on to a property that is not producing any income. You're paying for the utilities, you're paying for property taxes, insurance, and things while it's in vacant. And me personally having to go there twice, 3 times a week just to check in on it. It's not ideal, but having a strong rental criteria and sticking to it is so important, because you hear stories like what Anna's talking about and other people are talking about that really scare off people from becoming landlords, right, Anna?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's not for the faint of heart, I will say.
So I know you and Brian have a military and Navy background. I just wanted you to briefly talk about like how those could be good qualified tenants in your experience.
Yeah, and I will say, depending on whatever market you're in, another pro tip would be to kind of understand like what careers and what businesses are in the area that you are doing rentals in, and understanding that so that you can kind of target. I shouldn't say target because I feel like maybe that's a fair housing thing, depending on how you look at it. But so that you can cater to and advertise to certain groups, or like if that's your niche, then great. I will say check your local market and figure out what are the big employers and where are these people coming from. So military, for instance, if you are near a military base, they're great tenants. I mean, I will say part of it is they're getting BAH, that's the housing allowance that they get. So they get a consistent paycheck, consistent housing allowance. So you know the money's coming because the government usually pays them, at least, if nothing else. If they're not paying anybody else, they're at least paying the military most of the time when the government shuts down. So you have the stability of the pay. Honestly, the other thing too is these people are usually, especially when they come here to Northern Virginia, they're usually going to higher command posts. If military people will understand what I'm talking about, but they're heading to the Pentagon, to headquarters commands for different branches of service. So if they're in the military, they've been vetted. They normally have to go through screening processes. They have to have security clearances in, I think, all cases, or at least if they're here. I haven't met anyone that doesn't have a clearance. So they've already been pre-vetted by a very reputable, or depending on perspective, organization.
Yeah, true.
So you have that going for you already with military folks. It is just the consistency of pay. You know that they've already been vetted and had background checks. I will say probably the hardest part with military is, or the part that is kind of the con to those pros, is that the military will send military members wherever they are needed in that moment. In most cases, tours last 2 to 3 years, roughly. So when you have a tenant in, you can usually expect that they're going to be there for at least 2 to 3 years. But sometimes things change, wars break out. They're needed somewhere else because something happened, and there are federal laws in place that allow military members that are moved on orders. They can essentially break a lease. And all the notice, at least on the Virginia side, all they have to do is provide, like if they get it and they're leaving in 2 weeks, they just have to provide you 2 weeks notice because their orders are shipping them out in 2 weeks. So there is a little bit of that. That's probably the hard part, but that doesn't happen nearly as often as it probably sounds. Like I still would pick military members, but I am biased. Just saying.
No, but I agree. I mean, they can be great tenants. They're usually very disciplined. They have a routine that they're used to. I've actually experienced that a lot with like, I do midterm rentals, which we're not talking about too much, but the traveling nurses and things like that, they get their housing stipend and they are very responsible. When my last tenant moved out, it was probably cleaner when they got in there. So different tenant pools can be great tenants for you as a landlord or a landlord agent. But I wanted to talk specifically about the lease. So we talk about getting your licensing, getting the home prepped, you're marketing it, and then you find a great tenant, you accept them, woohoo, yeah, you're excited. And then you're going to help them write a lease, whether you're doing it for your own property or whether you're helping them with a landlord client. So what the lease needs to have, and every lease is going to be different, state dependent. So make sure you're either working with an agent like Anna and I to get the most up-to-date ones, or you're working with an attorney or somebody nearby that can give you the most up-to-date info. But these are the things that are going to need to be in the lease. And the standard one here in Maryland, I'm sure is the same in Virginia, have these things in them. So the first is the term, right? Are they a 12-month term? Are they a 24-month term? Those are probably the most common, but I've heard 36 months, so 3 years if somebody wants to live there for 3 years. The rental amount, right? How much are they paying monthly? At least here in Maryland, you actually have to disclose the total amount for the term. So let's just say $2,000 times 12. You have to tell them 24,000 is your payment. So that has to be crystal clear. Late fees, if there is late fees, that in our case, it's usually 5 days after the due date, which is usually the first, there's a charge. And you as the landlord or the landlord agent can write that in the lease. Who's in charge of maintenance, right? In the case that it's a long-term rental, Usually the tenant is responsible for certain maintenance items like toilet repairs or light bulbs, general maintenance, but the bigger ticket items may be the landlord's responsibility. So the Maryland lease has all that written out, but if there's certain things that you want to add, they give you space as well. Um, Pets. So that's probably very common. I'm sure Anna has experienced this, right? We love our fur babies, but anytime you're working with a rental, you need to be clear, like, hey, are you accepting pets or are you not accepting pets? Now there's emotional support animals, ESAs. Those ones you can't technically say no to as a landlord. So make sure you know that. They have to provide the right documentation. But if you are deciding to do pets, is there a pet deposit? Is there pet rents? Go ahead, Anna.
I was going to say there's also service animals, which are different
Service.
than ESA.
Okay.
Service animals, you have to be very careful with because those you can't ask documentation or medical questions about. There's like two
Gotcha.
questions that you can ask. And I think one of them is like, what is the pet trying to do? And how does the pet support you? Or I have to look them up. They're actually on a federal, like you can look up like service animals and fair housing and what questions you can ask. And there's two questions that you can ask, but you cannot ask for medical documentation on a service animal. You can with an ESA, but not with a service animal.
Good point. Good point. See, this is why I have you. You're the pro. It'll also include utilities, right? Most long-term rentals, the tenant is responsible for the electricity, the gas, the water. But I've heard landlords also be responsible for certain things like trash removal, or in some cases, I think they might be responsible for water. So that needs to be in black and white to know to set the expectations with your tenants. Occupancy, who's actually going to be living in the property? If it's a family, you want to even label out the kids. You want to have the name of the pet that's going to be there. I've heard countless stories of them saying they're going to have one pet. Next time they go there, there's 10 pets. So you want to be crystal clear. And then deposit handling. Actually, before deposit handling, smoking. I would say it's most common that smoking isn't allowed in the property. So you want to have that in writing. And then deposit handling. So deposit is a security deposit. It's refundable, but they have the Maryland contract. The Maryland lease has a whole 3 paragraphs explaining it's not going to be there for the last month's rent. It is there for making sure that the property is still good the way it was when they moved in, right? So I like to do like a walkthrough prior to when I'm given the keys, take a quick video, do a little checklist so that the tenant knows that everything is working. And that way there isn't any disputes when they move out and say, hey, we had this checklist, the fridge was working, everything was working, chip paints and things like that. So all that needs to be in your lease ahead of time. So I know there's probably a lot, but those were the key ones. Anything that you can think of that?
To add, so I know, and I'm going to speak to the Virginia side again. So for like fees, for instance, on our first page, we don't have to have the total amount for the year, but we have to list all the fees that the tenant will potentially have to pay. And that includes like move-in fees. Like if you're moving into like a condo or something, and if it's not on that first page, it's like the first page and like the top of the second page. If you don't have all of those fees documented on that first page, you cannot legally charge the tenant for it, and the landlord would have to eat it. So if you forget to put like a move-in elevator fee of $500 that the complex charges, and you don't put it on that first page and disclose it to the tenant, then the landlord has to eat it and has to actually pay it. You can't charge that to the tenant. So I will say that. And then with late fees, I will say make sure you understand your state rules for late fees, because in many states they set a maximum of how much you can charge in late fees. And so like Virginia, I think it's 10% of the monthly rent or the balance that's due. So like I personally don't accept partial payments. I refuse to accept partial
Same.
payments, partly because if you accept the partial payment and then you try to evict them, that basically the clock starts over if you accept the partial payment because you've accepted some payment for the property. So I don't accept partial payments, but in Virginia, I think it's 10% is of the monthly rent that's due that's late. That's the max that you can charge. I don't charge the max. The way that I do it is I charge like if they're late after day 5, there's $100 late fee. And then I charge $5 every day they're late after that up to the maximum.
Yeah, such a good point. And one thing that I thought of about the Maryland side as well, as this actually just happened to me, is you cannot, as a landlord, charge more than 1 month's rent as a security deposit. So even if they have a pet, right? So let's just say they have a pet and you want to collect a pet deposit, which is probably pretty common. Legally, you can't have more than, if you're renting 2,000, you can't accept more than $2,000 as a security deposit. So you might have to increase maybe the monthly rent. So I've seen anywhere from an extra $50 per pet or 100, depending on how many pets. So just one thing that I thought of that you want to be aware of on the Maryland side. So again, it's always changing. Reach out to Anna or me if you're trying to learn more about the Maryland side or the Virginia side. But I know we are getting close on time, right, Anna? So now that you built up your 7 units, and now after selling off a few units, what are like some green flags? Like when the tenant comes in, what is something that you're like, oh, like this could be a good tenant?
So I will say, I know for Virginia agents through the Virginia Association of Realtors, we get a subscription for free, but there's an app called Forewarn, which you can pay for if you don't get it through your association. So every single tenant that I get, regardless of whether it's for clients or for myself, when they initially reach out and make contact, I put everyone through Forewarn. I put that phone number in, and that for us will give us aliases, previous addresses, what vehicles they have, any court cases or evictions or criminal convictions, anything in that. It's limited. It's not a full background check, but at least gives me a snapshot of the person that I am engaging with on, initial contact. That doesn't stop me from speaking to them. I still give them the opportunity to fill out the form, to go tour the property, do the application, because I don't want any fair housing violations. But at least I kind of, going into it, can usually tell from the initial background search I get from that app that we have of whether it's a green flag or a red flag with this particular person. Like, they have evictions on there, if they have any felonies. Again, we can't discriminate in a lot of cases based on criminal record, but I am like, okay, I have an idea of what we're walking into. Someone that doesn't follow the rules, I usually put little Easter eggs in some of the listings to see if someone actually read the listing through to understand the full criteria. And so I'll send them the rental criteria, and at the bottom I'll say, please respond with the word received once you've read this email. And when they do, I'm like, yes, they read it all the way through to the bottom. And then, or if someone responds back and asks me questions that are in that email with the criteria and next steps, then I'm like, okay, they're clearly not reading through. It seems minor, but some of these things end up being character flaws or indications of things that may be a problem in the future, just on first glance. Then there's other issues. I would say follow your gut and make
That's
sure.
exactly what I was going to say. And follow your gut. So when you're actually meeting with these people and they're they give off a good vibe, you could tell they're nice. Is it okay if I plant a few things? I don't know. In my opinion, I'm like, of course, this will be your home. So trust your gut. And we're going to talk about red flags. But in my experience, in the years that I've been doing this, if you have an inkling that they're not going to be a good tenant, dig a little bit deeper. I always talk to Anna. I'm like, hey, what do you think of this situation or this situation? So why don't we actually just talk about red flags now? Because I think one of the first ones that I did, now it is a red flag. They're still great tenants, but looking back, it kind of is a red flag. But if somebody is super urgent to move, right? And I know we talk about this all the time, but if somebody's like, I need to move in tomorrow or this weekend, and you're meeting with them on a Wednesday, it's like, okay, well, are you what's going on? Are you running from something, or are you getting evicted? So usually, it's funny because my first tenant I ever placed was kind of like that, but they ended up being great. But that's something that I can think of as a red flag. Anything that you can think of that's all right, this is kind of, we talked about having a gut feeling, but is there anything else that you can think of?
I guess if you're a tenant that's I can pay out cash and you don't need to run the background check. I'm like, okay.
Or pay everything up front. I'll pay for 6 months, and you have no idea how many times I've gotten that. Hey, I'll pay for 6 months. My credit is not good, which I appreciate the upfront, but that can be a red flag as well. Paying a year or something, because what happens after that year? Oh, I don't
Yeah.
have money.
Yeah. And when their application comes back, honestly, if they do end up applying, if they have recent credit issues, that is obviously, I think, another obvious red flag, because there's some people that maybe their credit scores are really close, and I look at their history and they did have issues, but it's clear that there was a point where they got back on the wagon and they've been able to consistently pay things. And so when I see that, I'm like, okay, they've turned over, like they've been able to turn that corner and they're consistently paying. But to me, a red flag for someone that's like, they applied, but just last month their credit report shows they were late on their car and their credit card. I mean, I know people have to have a home, but clearly there is a issue with the managing funds that is still prevalent, and that could cause problems in the future.
Yeah. I mean, listen, this is a business, right? Whether
Yep.
we're doing it for our own properties or if we're doing it for our clients' properties, right? Our tenants are our biggest asset, right? That's the
Okay.
theme of this episode. So you want to try and do it right the first time. You want to have somebody that's in there that's going to be responsible. We talk about all these red flags, the evictions and things like that. You want to have a good rental criteria. But at the end of the day, it really is to make sure that you get the right person in there that's going to take care of the property, pay on time, and be respectful. Because I think that's the most important. I know Ann and I both respect our tenants as landlords, and that is our biggest asset. So we want to make sure we're setting the right expectations, taking care of them. Sometimes I leave like holiday gift baskets or cookies or something to let them know that we appreciate them, because some landlords, and rightly, get a bad rap, right? You know, the slim in the business. So we want to make sure that if we are getting good quality tenants, that we're taking good care of them as well.
Yep. I completely agree.
So we are on our last 5 minutes, and I wanted to do our quick rapid questions. So what is in your opinion, like your biggest screening mistake that you see people do when they're trying to do rentals?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I guess I will say, I mean, aside from not screening everyone over the age of 18, I think that's a big one. Like I mentioned that one earlier. And I guess some people don't look at the reports, I think, as deeply as they should, especially if you're an agent and you have the ability to kind of dig in a little deeper with like tools, like I mentioned, Forewarned or calling references. Like it's kind of our responsibility to try to ensure that we're vetting the right person. So I will say some people just look at it and they're like, oh, it looks okay, but they never call any references to actually confirm that it's accurate, or you don't use their tools if they have them to confirm like other information. Because sometimes I've had applicants that will put one address as their current address, but then the background check comes up with another one. So then I use some of my tools and there's others. And so I go back to the tenant directly. I said, like, which one is your current address? And then I pull out an address that they weren't even expecting me to know about. And they're like, oh, that's my cousin's address that I was like living in for like a while. And so I will say not calling references and not as an agent and not using the tools that you have at your disposal, the back out of side of the background report out of the application, to just take the extra couple minutes to make sure that the information is accurate and it's valid.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is taking their word for like for Bible. Like, what do they say? Buyers are liars, sellers are worse, but tenants can have their own little stories. I'm telling you. And I've heard quite a bit. And yes, we are humans. We understand that life happens sometimes and things like that. But if they're going to give you 10 different excuses why the credit score is not above 600 and things like that, like, hey, I appreciate you coming to see the property. I really enjoyed meeting you, but this is our rental criterion. And unfortunately, you don't do that. So again, just vetting is so important, and doing that up front.
Yeah. So what's one lease clause you think people forget about?
Yeah. I think being very specific with how maintenance items and communication with the landlord is moving forward, right? So maintenance items, again, I talked about like the pre-move-in walkthrough, set all the expectations, put the hot water on, make sure that hot water's running, things like that, to make sure that the home is obviously livable. What I like to do is after a week after they move in, just check in. Hey, just checking in. Is everything still working okay? And that way they feel like you actually care, obviously. And so setting that expectations, because 2-3 months down the road, when they're like, the toilet is clogged. Oh, well, that's technically your guys' responsibility, right? Because your toddler put the rubber ducky down the toilet. That's on you guys. So setting that expectations, and then actually how you like to be communicated, right? So I use a portal called Turbo Tenant that you're able to message directly to the landlord. I like that a little bit better than actually giving my personal phone, just because I'm an agent. I get so many calls all the time and I can't keep up with it. So having a one hub that I make sure that you're actually looking and doing it in a timely manner. You can set it up so that it pings you on your phone or emails you. But I think that's probably the most, is setting the right expectations. I don't know, but I guess that's not really a clause, but it's something that I just thought of.
So on my leases, I will say sometimes it is very property specific to add an addendum or like an extra page to put. So like I have a property that has a I'll say space in the back of the house, and they're not numbered. So one, I can number them and just make it easier. But like I have parking restrictions as one of the clauses. So if there's a shared space between multiple tenants, if it's like a duplex or a multi-unit building, in there, the clause very specifically states how many cars they can park and where they are allowed to park. And if they park in the other spot, there is an odd chance that they'll get towed. So I'm very specific with that. What else is there that they're specific? Some of the clauses are very property specific. Like I don't think they think about parking if there's like a shared parking area. If you have a multi-unit building, we've talked about the pet stuff. I think for Virginia, at least if you're working with an agent using a Northern Virginia license or contract that's been drafted by attorneys, it hits quite a few of the clauses. If you're making up your own, I'll say lease as a self-managing landlord, there's probably a very long list of clauses that you would forget to include, like late fees, how to pay rent. Like all of my tenants have to pay electronically. I don't accept cash. I don't accept check. All payments must be paid electronically. And that is a clause in my lease that states that, and that they are required to set up a tenant portal to make those payments.
Use the state appointed leases. And if you don't have access to them, reach out to Anna and I. We'd be happy to supply them.
If you're an agent,
if you're an agent. Yeah, right.
Don't get us in trouble.
That's true. So last final question, Anna. So door one, somebody looking to buy their first property, in your opinion, what do you think? Should they hire a property manager that does everything we just talked about, or self-manage themselves?
Ooh. So this is a tough one because personally, I think everyone should know how to manage the property. Not necessarily because I think they should self-manage forever, but because then they learn what they like and what they don't like, and then they can hire the right property manager. And I say that because of the experience that we had. But I will say the curve with that is if you're managing your first property yourself, you do have to learn how to do that. So I recommend listening to podcasts like this, chatting with people like us, going to investor meetups, talking to other landlords, and kind of picking their brain about the systems that work for them. So you're not completely failing forward on your own. But I think everyone should at least understand how to manage a property in the beginning so that they know how they want their properties managed going forward by other people.
I agree 100%. And nowadays there's a lot of tools and softwares that you can use to help self-manage. There's a great book called The Self-Managing Landlord from Amelia and Grace, who have been on our podcast before. So learn the system. Yes, there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve, but there's free tools that we personally use that can help hopefully make it easier. So that's going to do it for another episode. If you liked it, found value, please like, share, subscribe. Look at that. And you can reach out to me, N Garcia Official, on all social platforms. And you can reach out to Anna at
I'm Annabolic _realtor on all platforms.
Thanks, guys. Tune in to the next one.